Hello and welcome back to the Multiplatform modding series with Architectury for Minecraft. And in the last episode we added block states and added our Ruby crate block. And in this episode we want to go one step further to making our Ruby crate block into an actual crate, meaning that we can store items in it, by adding a block entity for our Ruby crate block, which is the basis for the item storage we'll implement later. And with block entities, we will encounter our first small roadblock in the sense that we need to write actual mod loader specific code. So today we will create the block entity itself. We will add it to a Ruby crate block, and we will create also a ticker for our block entity so that we can actually test if everything worked we've done so far, because a block entity without any functionality like an inventory or something like that would typically not really show its existence in the game. So we are going to add a ticker so that we can actually see that the block entity is there and works. So let's start by essentially going back to where we ended last episode and slightly destroying the simpleness of our Ruby crate block, because in the last episode we used the directional block as a superclass for our Ruby crate block so that we didn't have to worry about implementing the facing property, which in itself is not a big deal, but since we want to add a block entity to this block, we can no longer use directional block here, but instead we need to implement the base entity block here, because this is the basis for our block entities. And as you can see now, our facing property is no longer in this class. So we need to add our facing property back in. And a property facing is, in this case, an enum property for the direction. And we need to also initialize this property, which we'll do with a static block. And there we set our facing property to block state properties.facing. With that, we now have our property back in, but as you can still see, we have our codec still not correctly working, because instead of directional block here, we now extend base entity block. And so we need to put base entity block here for our codec, because we no longer have the directional block as a superclass, but as I said, the base entity block. Now, that's pretty much everything we need to do to preserve the block states. And that will now already work back in the game again. But as you can see, we still are missing something. And this is because this base entity block requires us to implement an additional method called new block entity. And for now, this method, we will just let it return null because we don't have a block entity for our Ruby crate block yet. And this is the step we're going to do next. We need a block entity for this block. And for this, we're going to create a new package in our blocks package here, call it entities. And in this entities package, we create a new class and call it Ruby crate entity. And this Ruby crate entity extends block entity. For now, it extends just block entity. There are other more advanced types of block entities, but I'll come talk about them when we actually get to a point where we need those. But for now, we just want a regular block entity, so we create a block entity, and then we need also a constructor for our public Ruby crate entity. And this constructor requires two parameters. The first is the block pos, the position of the block of this entity, and the block state, the state of the block that this entity is linked to. And what we need to do in here is call a superconstructor, and the first parameter I'll put in null right now here. But this is again something we need to replace later, because this is the type of our block entity. But since we don't have a block entity type for this entity yet, we can just put it to null. We can just put it to null right now. What I'm also going to do to save on later is create a public static class ticker in here. And we need a type parameter for t extends block entity here. And this class implements block entity ticker. And here again, we pass the t. And this is the ticker we use later to check if our block entity has actually implemented correctly. We implement the tick method in here, and then we can just put in a log message. I've already prepared one, which prints out which prints us the position of the block, the state of the block, and the entity type that of the block entity that this ticker is linked to. And we will now link this ticker to our Ruby crate block. And for this, we're going to implement the getTicker method here. And here we simply return a new Ruby crate entity.ticker. And that is everything we need to do to check if our block entity is implemented correctly later. Now we can also go in here and pass here a new Ruby crate entity with the post and state we get as parameters here. And with that, we've done everything we need to do in our block class. But now we still need our block entity type. And for this, we're going to create a new class here and call those tutorial mod block entity types. Long name, but not the longest we'll write today. And in this class, again, similar to every other class where we register types of stuff, we first need a private static final deferred register for block entity type, question mark. We'll call it block entities, and we call deferred register.create for our mod ID and the registry type registries.block entity type. Then we will also need to create our public static registry supplier. Same thing we've done so many times. And here we want to supply a block entity type for our Ruby crate entity and call it Ruby_crate. Then we will also want again a helper method that makes it easier to register this, but this time it's slightly simpler than for blocks and items because we only need the resource location once and not a resource key again. But now we have a small problem because we can create a method here, public static void write register. That's the name I call it, because the only thing we'll do in here is essentially call block entities.register. Because the problem is we cannot initialize this Ruby crate from this method. Why? Because we cannot construct a block entity type. If we check out the block entity type down here, we can see that the only way to initialize it would be the constructor. And this constructor is marked private. So we can't call this constructor from this class. And there is no other way to use the vanilla Minecraft classes to create a block entity type. I don't know why, because in earlier versions of the game, there was actually a builder inside of this class that you could use to construct block entity types. But this is no longer the case. So we need to do a little workaround, or more technically use a workaround that the authors of Fabric and NeoForge already did for us. So, but before we do this, we can now go inside of our Ruby crate entity here and replace this type with our actual block entity type, which we've now created by doing this. And with that, we've done everything we can do right now in the common part. And now we need to get into modloader specific code. So the first thing, let's start with Fabric. We're going to create a new package and call it blocks.entities, similar to our blocks entities package up here. And now we're going to create a class in here and call it tutorial mod block entity types Fabric. And in this class, we can now use the Fabric methods to construct a block entity type. So let's extend our tutorial mod block entity types class so that we can access the fields we've put in here and the methods we defined in here more easily, and create a new method, public static void init block entity types. And in this method, we can now use the Fabric methods to create a block entity type. So we call our register block entity method we defined in the common class to initialize our Ruby crate, put in the name of our block entity type, in this case Ruby crate, and then use the lambda notation to use the block entity type. And here we now need to call the Fabric block entity type builder dot create. And now we need to provide our block entity type constructor Ruby create entity and then new. And then we need to provide the block this is linked to, in our case tutorial mod blocks.rubycrate.get, and then we need to call build without any parameters. And with this we've initialized our Ruby crate block entity type. We now need to write it with the deferred register, so we call the write register method we defined here to write our deferred register to game registries, and that is everything we need to do here. Now we need to call this method from our tutorial mod Fabric common class, not from the client runnable here, but from the common class here. And below our common init here, we can initialize the Fabric specific components. In our case, tutorial mod entity types Fabric.init block entity types. Now we would have a block entity type, but only in Fabric. We still need to register the same block entity type under NeoForge, so we now go down to the NeoForge module and create again a new package, blocks.entities, and again create a new class and call it tutorial mod block entity types NeoForge. And in this class, similar to the Fabric one, we can extend our tutorial mod block entity types and create a public static void init block entity types. And in here we can now also initialize our Ruby crate using the register block entity type method, put in the name Ruby underscore crate. Did I write create? Oh, I wrote create here. I mean crate. And then again a lambda notation. In this case we can use new block entity type because in NeoForge for some reason this constructor is now public. Yeah, NeoForge decided to make the constructor here public. Fabric decided to build in a completely different system to create this entity type. Vanilla chooses that we can't create any entity types directly. But again, we need to put in some parameters here. The first is we need the constructor for our entity, and then we need to provide the block that we actually want to link with this block entity type, and this is our Ruby crate. And with this, we should have everything, except we need still to call the NeoForge block entity type registration. So our tutorial mod block entity types NeoForge.init block entity types. And that should be everything we need to do to add a block entity to the game for our Ruby crate. So let's launch the game and see if we can get this log message to print. So with that, we'll come to a Fabric client of our mod, and we can get a Ruby crate from our creative inventory and then place it down. And as you can now see down below here in the console, we see, if I press F3 real quick, we see that we have a ticker at the location 20.113-2, which is the location of the block I'm looking at right now, our Ruby crate. We see we have the block state for our Ruby crate facing south, which is also matching what the game tells us. And we see that we have a Ruby crate entity at this location. And if we break it, the ticker stops. And if we go to another location and place it, for example, up, we see we now have a facing up with the different coordinates, which are the correct ones for this block, and also the Ruby crate entity. So in Fabric, we can see that the block entity for this Ruby crate has been successfully registered. So let's jump over to NeoForge and see if it's the case there as well. Yeah, as you can see, it did not work under NeoForge, and the reason for this is quite simply because, as the log tells us, the Ruby crate is not initialized. And why is it? Because similar to, I believe, the first episode on items, I forgot to call the default register to actually write the stuff to the game. So if we call the write register method in our tutorial mod blocks, in our tutorial mod block entity types NeoForge, what a name, class, then it should work. So let's launch the game again and see if it does. And with that, welcome to NeoForge. And let's place down our block. And as you can see, now it works. We see our ticker at -16, 64, -37, and that is the location of our block. We have the Ruby crate facing east, which is the correct block state for our block. And we have the entity type Ruby crate entity, which is also matching. So again, go to another place and place it in another orientation. And as you can see, the information is also correct. So our Ruby crate entity also exists under NeoForge. And that concludes block entity basics. You now know how to add a block entity to a block. You also know how to add a ticker to a block entity. So if you want a block entity that does something every tick or every few ticks, you can implement this using the ticker class we created. And in the next episode, we are going another step towards actually storing items in our Ruby crate by actually adding an inventory for our Ruby crate so that we can open and place items in it and take items out of it again, and then have those items be stored inside this crate. See you then. Goodbye. Thanks for watching.